Many medieval buildings are still standing strong after 700 years. So why are modern buildings crumbling after just 70? We live in an age of concrete towers and glass facades, yet walk through any medieval town and you'll find timber-framed houses from the 1400s still lived in, stone churches that have survived storms and wars, and castles that haven't moved an inch in centuries. How is it that buildings created without modern tools have outlasted so many built with them? This video explores the forgotten genius of medieval construction and what it reveals about the way we build today. We'll look at the materials, the techniques, the design philosophy, and the intentions behind medieval buildings. From cathedrals to cottages, from cobblestone to limestone, we'll uncover why these structures endure and why that endurance matters. It's not just a story about stone and timber. It's a story about mindset, time, and what it means to build something meant to last. One of the most striking differences between medieval and modern buildings lies in the materials. Medieval builders relied almost entirely on what was available in their immediate environment, and they understood those materials deeply. Stone was quarried locally, lime was slaked on site for mortar, timber came from nearby forests, chosen by hand, seasoned naturally, and shaped with tools that preserved the grain and strength of the wood. Each material was selected not just for availability, but for longevity. Oak beams used in roofs and framing could last for centuries if kept dry and properly ventilated. Sandstone and limestone, chosen for churches and castles, were not only beautiful but resilient to weathering. Even wattle and daub, a humble mix of straw, clay, and animal dung, was flexible, breathable, and surprisingly durable when protected from direct rain. Because materials were expensive in time and labor, nothing was wasted. Offcuts of timber were reused. Stones were recarved and repurposed. Medieval masons often built with the idea that their work might outlive them. And so they treated every joint and jointing surface with precision. These materials also shaped the feel of a building. The texture of hewn stone, the scent of aged timber, the soft plastered surfaces. They created a sensory experience that modern materials rarely match. These buildings weren't just strong, they were rooted in place, carrying the essence of the earth and labor that formed them. This grounding also created emotional attachment. People could literally feel the connection between the materials and the land around them. When a villager walked into their home, they knew which hill the stone had come from, or which grove had provided the timbers. The walls weren't anonymous, they were familiar, and this intimacy bred care. Maintenance was not outsourced, it was communal, familial, expected. Every generation added their imprint to the same walls. Importantly, natural materials aged gracefully. Where concrete cracks and stains, a medieval wall simply weathered into something more beautiful. Moss and lichen softened the stone, sun darkened the beams, and time added character. Today, we pressure wash and repaint. Back then, age was a kind of patina, a badge of honor, not a flaw to erase. Time, and how it was spent, played a crucial role. Medieval builders didn't rush. Construction could take years, even decades, and that wasn't seen as a problem. Cathedrals took generations, and no one expected to see them finished in their lifetime. That long perspective shaped the way things were built. It wasn't just about efficiency, it was about excellence. Stonemasons, carpenters, and blacksmiths all trained in systems of apprenticeship that could last 7 years or more. Mastery was valued over speed. A single joint, a keystone, or an arch might be labored over for days to ensure it would bear weight not just for decades, but for centuries. This craftsmanship is visible even today. Walk through a medieval town, and you can still see tool marks in stone, hand-cut joints in wood, and ironwork forged with care. Builders knew their materials intimately and worked with them rather than against them. Walls were built thick, not only for structure, but for insulation and stability. Roofs were pitched steeply, not just for style, but to shed snow and rain. Modern construction often prioritizes speed and cost. Prefabrication, outsourcing, and digital modeling allow buildings to rise fast, but sometimes at the expense of integrity. Contractors work against tight deadlines. Materials are chosen for price rather than longevity. And design is separated from the people who do the actual building. In contrast, medieval building sites were communities. Laborers, artisans, and designers worked side by side. There was no division between architect and builder. They were often the same person. The process was slow, yes, but that slowness allowed for care, correction, and adaptation. And this patience fostered accountability. A mason would sometimes carve a mark into their stonework, not as a signature of ego, but of responsibility. They took pride in what they left behind, because they knew it would stand long after they were gone. In fact, some builders left hidden messages or carvings in beams and stones, symbols, initials, even prayers. These weren't just flourishes, but signs of connection between creator and structure, between labor and legacy. And yet the construction process wasn't frozen in tradition. It evolved. Techniques were passed down, but also adapted. Builders improved on what they inherited. A church built in 1200 might be expanded in 1350 with flying buttresses. A house might receive a second story, a larger hearth, or more weatherproofing. Their view of permanence included change, but always within the logic of the original design. The strength of medieval buildings also came from how they were physically put together, starting from the ground up. Foundations were often dug deep, lined with stone, and placed on stable soil with drainage in mind. Builders didn't rely on poured concrete or rebar. Instead, they used sheer mass and careful layering to prevent collapse. They knew their terrain intimately, building with the landscape, not against it. The walls they raised were thick, sometimes up to a meter across, not just for structural integrity, but for temperature regulation and sound insulation. A thick stone or timber wall could keep out summer heat and hold in winter warmth. It also muffled sound, preserved privacy, and added a psychological sense of security that thinner modern walls lack. Medieval builders used gravity and friction to their advantage. Arches, vaults, and buttresses weren't just decorative. They distributed weight naturally, allowing buildings to rise higher without modern steel reinforcement. Roofs extended beyond the walls to direct rainwater away from the foundations, while drip edges and leadwork prevented erosion and rot. Compare this to many contemporary structures, where walls can be just centimeters thick and insulation relies on synthetic panels. Noise travels easily, temperatures swing wildly, and repairs are difficult and expensive. Lightness has become the goal, but at the cost of endurance. What's remarkable is how simple the medieval solutions were, and how effective. They weren't perfect, of course, but they were built to withstand storms, seasons, and centuries of use. We often marvel at their survival, but the truth is, they were meant to survive. Even in cases of damage, these buildings were designed to fail gradually, not catastrophically. A cracked arch might shift, but not collapse. A leaky roof could be rethatched without stripping the entire structure. These systems of strength and flexibility made medieval buildings not just strong, but forgiving. And because they were built from few but sturdy elements, each part was understandable. You could trace the pressure, follow the load, see where stress collected. There were no mysteries behind drywall. It was engineering as intuition. Such knowledge was often instinctive, not written. Most builders were illiterate, but their understanding of form, force, and function was rich, practical, and tested. A master mason didn't need blueprints to know where to place a support beam. He could feel it in the weight of stone and the bend of timber. This silent knowledge, passed through apprenticeship and repetition, formed the hidden skeleton of medieval resilience. Medieval buildings weren't sealed boxes. They were designed to breathe. Walls made from lime plaster and timber allowed moisture to pass through rather than trapping it, preventing mold and rot. Roof lines extended well past the walls, not for decoration, but for protection, keeping wind and rain away from the vulnerable seams. High-pitched roofs allowed snow to slide off easily, while deeply recessed windows reduced direct sunlight in summer and preserved warmth in winter. Ventilation was passive but clever. Openings at different heights, combined with the thickness of the walls, allowed warm air to rise and escape, pulling in cooler air from lower levels. In summer, shutters and interior courtyards helped regulate temperature without the need for mechanical cooling. And in winter, tapestries, wooden paneling, and layered fabrics acted as movable insulation. Modern buildings often ignore these principles. With the rise of sealed glass facades and centralized HVAC systems, we've created interiors that rely on energy-hungry solutions to maintain comfort, often while fighting against the natural rhythms of the seasons. But medieval builders worked with nature, not against it. Their buildings were part of the landscape, responding to its conditions rather than trying to dominate them. In doing so, they created homes that weren't just shelter, but partners in human survival. And these passive systems also meant lower ongoing costs. No fuel bills, no complex repairs, no fragile dependence on external grids. Just smart, weather-wise design. This approach also reduced ecological impact. Local sourcing meant fewer emissions. Breathable walls and natural insulation meant no reliance on chemical treatments. Buildings returned to the earth slowly, naturally, without toxic residue. In a time before climate awareness, their habits were low impact by necessity, but also by wisdom. They saw nature not as a backdrop, but as a co-architect. They even anticipated extreme weather events by observing how wind moved across hills, how water drained across fields, and how trees offered shelter. In other words, the environment wasn't the enemy. It was a design partner. Medieval buildings were not static monuments. They were living structures, adapted and repaired generation after generation. Because they were made with natural, accessible materials, nearly everything in a building could be fixed by local craftsmen, or even by the owners themselves. Roof tiles were replaced, beams braced, mortar repointed. Not every century, but every season. Lime mortar, unlike modern cement, remained flexible. It could crack without crumbling, and it was easily patched. Roofs were designed so that individual elements, slates, shingles, or thatch, could be swapped out with ease. Timber beams were accessible, and joinery was visible and serviceable. In short, these buildings were meant to be maintained, not replaced. Contrast that with many modern buildings where essential systems are hidden, sealed, or proprietary. When something breaks, it often requires specialized parts, expensive tools, or full replacement. Walls are painted drywall, not breathable lime. Repairs are cosmetic, meant to hide problems, not resolve them. The medieval approach accepted decay as part of life. Maintenance wasn't a nuisance, it was a tradition. Homeowners were stewards, not just residents. Buildings were patched with the same reverence as they were built, and small interventions kept them whole. This philosophy of continuity kept buildings standing not despite their age, but because of it. Generations worked together to extend the life of their homes. A grandfather might lay a stone a child would later repair, and that practice fostered identity. Buildings weren't just homes, but family legacies. They held stories, embedded in every beam and joint. The marks of care were visible, and that made the structure not just stronger, but more loved. And perhaps that's the difference that matters most. When you live in something built to last, you treat it differently. You patch it, protect it, and pass it on. Not because it's old, but because it's yours. We've inherited their structures, but not always their values. And perhaps now, in a time of climate strain and housing uncertainty, it's worth reclaiming some of those values. Care over convenience, longevity over speed, and respect for the craft that holds up our walls. Maybe the true strength of medieval buildings wasn't just in stone and wood, but in the mindset that shaped them. Today, we measure buildings in decades. Back then, they thought in centuries. Would you rather live in a 700-year-old home or a 30-year-old one? Subscribe for more lessons from the medieval world that still matter today.